So let's get started with early Triumph riding stupidity. All right, Rick. If you somehow managed to live through the first month or so of riding a bike, chances were fairly good that you scared the living shit out of yourself so much that you'd probably survive the rest of your days. I guess I was stupider than most new bike riders, but somehow managed to not get killed or even crash. After the first week of riding my new Triumph, I started getting pretty cocky. This is probably the most dangerous period an immature 20-year-old can go through. Typically arrogant, I learned how to accelerate hard through the gears, lean the bike over some in the turns, and in general, act like a real asshole in traffic. One thing bothered me though. Whenever I started the bike up cold, it ran great, and for the first 10 minutes or so, the Triumph would run okay. But as the bike got up to operating temperature, it would start running worse and worse. By the time it got hot, it simply wouldn't rev over mid-range and the exhaust would get all smoky and black. Luckily, I ran into a savvy Triumph rider, he'd been riding almost 6 months, and explained my technical problem to me. With one glance, he spotted the glitch. You know, this thing would run a lot better if you would turn the choke off after you started the bike up. On the handlebars was a small chromed lever that I had never touched, figuring that if I didn't know what it was, I'd be best to leave it alone. Squatting down, I could see now that the lever was attached to a cable and then it ran into the top of the carb. My new friend explained that when I was starting the bike up cold, the choke should be closed. After starting, the lever should be pushed back, leaving the carb throat opening unobstructed. The next time I rode the bike, I moved the choke lever back and the bike ran great. Even when it got hotter, another lesson learned. But it took a real scare to teach me another lesson. When I used to leave the Naval Air Station at Sanford, the guard would wave me through the gate and I'd ride conservatively out to the first intersection. After the intersection was a long straightaway, and this was a fun section. I'd raise the revs, drop the clutch, and accelerate as hard as I could through the gears. Just about the time fourth gear was wound out, I would pass a small bus stop shelter. This was my marker to start slowing down. Some experimenting showed that if I started hitting the rear brake and down gearing, I was able to slow down enough to make the 90-degree corner up ahead. Naturally, I never even thought of using that dangerous front brake, having been warned by friends of its lethal nature. A few times, I had edged slightly past the bus stop before starting the slowdown and had barely been able to scrub off enough speed to make the turn. One afternoon, as I was getting ready to head into town to look for dumb, young, and hopefully pretty girls, being horny, dumb, and young would do, a friend asked me for a ride into Sanford. At this point, I had never packed double, but what the hell? The saddle was long enough and there was a set of passenger pegs on the back. How hard could it be? On the way to the gate, I felt the extra weight of my passenger, but the bike still handled more or less normal based on my limited knowledge. After the guard waved us through, I rode easily up to that first intersection, stopped, put the bike in neutral, and warned my passenger, "Hang on to me real tight because I'm going to let it all hang out down this straight." "Sure, it sounds like fun," he said. He grabbed tight and I stuffed the Triumph into low gear, revved it up real good, and slipped the clutch brutally as the bike fought against the weight of 2 people during acceleration. First gear felt strong, and when I shifted into second and pinned the throttle again, the front end lifted off the pavement a few inches. Bitchin', a wheelie. Third gear and the Triumph gained speed. Speed tears started coming out of the corner of my eyes, and my hair fluttered wildly in the breeze. Fourth gear and the big 650 kept building revs cleanly. Soon the bus stop shelter was close, and I figured I ought to start thinking about getting ready to slow down. As soon as I passed the bus stop sign, I stomped on the rear brake and was rewarded with a loud squeal from the rear tire. I dropped down to third, and the engine braking helped slow the bike down some more. I kept pressure on the rear brake, and the Triumph slowed more. Second gear was engaged. The engine revs howled, and the rear end chattered. The turn was coming up way too fast. I couldn't understand why. After all, I had started braking in the same spot that I always did. It never entered my mind that having a 180-pound passenger on the back of the bike would greatly increase the braking distance. A few seconds later, I realized that there was no way that I was going to be able to make the sharp right-handed turn. Not a chance in hell. But at least I had the common sense to keep the bike straight up and scrub off as much speed as I could before I had to deal with what was beyond the dense brush that I knew I was going to ride through. We blasted through the brush and the weeds at maybe 40 miles per hour. Then as the front of the bike broke clear of the growth, I saw a cement culvert directly up ahead. There was absolutely no chance of stopping, as the drop-off to the culvert was about 10 feet in front of me. I braced hard, squeezed the grips, and instinctively stood up on the pegs. The Triumph sailed off the cement lip and soared through the air. Luckily, it landed dead center on the flat bottom of the drainage culvert, which was covered with about 15 inches of water, moss, slime, and muck. Amazingly, the bike didn't fall, and the landing was not all that bad. Just a big whoop. A spray of goop came up from the wheels, and the bike slithered around on the tractionless surface for a good 50 yards before it stopped. I looked up stunned. Here we were, sitting in the flat bottom of a V-shaped culvert with 10-foot-high walls, virtually uninjured. My passenger let loose of my chest, got off the bike, looked around, and let me have it. "You dumb fuckhead! You almost got us killed. If I had known you were going to jump off the road and into this ditch, I'd have walked into town." Actually, I didn't plan on doing this. Guess I was going too fast. Look, at least it was better than us crashing, right? Yeah, swell. Now how the fuck are we going to get out of here? This might be a problem. Not only were the cement walls about 10 feet high, they were steeply slanted and covered with slick green moss. My passenger tried to climb up the wall on all fours and slipped back down to the flat part, flat on his chest. "Jesus H. Christ on a pogo stick! Look at me, I'm covered with mud and frog shit. I'm gonna look real great at the dance tonight." I sat there on the bike trying to think my way out of this situation. About that time, the bugs started attacking us with a vengeance. Every afternoon in Florida, the mosquitoes come out of hiding and start looking for victims to suck blood. It's bad enough under normal conditions, but when you're sitting smack in the middle of their breeding grounds, it's truly miserable. They swarmed all around us, flying up our noses and into our mouths when we tried to talk. All sorts of other bugs joined them, crawling all over our bare arms, landing on our heads and fighting the voracious mosquitoes for property rights. Having no choice, we decided to fire up the bike and proceed onward, hoping to find a spot where we might be able to clamber out. We rode for a solid 20 minutes, all 4 feet hanging out like pontoons, skidding and slithering through the goop and mire. Snakes darted out of the way, frogs hopped up and down in a near state of panic, and the giant swarm of bugs kept gnawing and biting away at us like the plague from hell. Luckily, the muck in the bottom never got more than a foot or so deep. By the time we found a shallow, dry wall to climb out of, we were covered from head to foot with slime. Actually, the slime sort of helped keep the bugs from eating us alive. It took another half hour to manhandle the heavy Triumph out of the culvert, and we were gasping and wheezing by the time it was back on level ground. Not much was said as we headed back to the base to clean up. The guard at the gate looked at us like we were from Mars, but waved us through with a frown on his face. The swarm of bugs followed us all the way to the barracks, and was even there the next day when I went out to wash the bike off. Diary of an ex-street rider. I don't ride street bikes much now, even though that was the way all of us started way back then. Why not? Think about this for a moment. If you ride a street bike nice and slow within the street limit, nothing could be more boring. And if you go fast, where it's a thrill, then chances are high that you'll either get a ticket and a huge fine, or get blindsided by some moron in a Trans Am who's dialing in his stereo instead of watching for that little speeding speck, which is you on a bike. So when I was approached to take a road ride, I thought twice. "Hey," said a friend, "you really ought to try some street riding for a change. Get out of that dirt bike rut. Why don't you take a trip to Frisco and back with me and some of my buddies this weekend?" A flashback to my street riding days of the past jumped into my brain very clearly. Let's see, I was 20 years old and stationed in the U.S. Navy down in Florida. Check one more of the following: bugs, rain, heat, humidity, neat place to ride, a scoot, all of the above. If you checked F, you get the big pat on the back prize. Yep, Florida was an okay place to ride, except for a few things, like the places alongside the interstate highways that you stopped at for food and gas. Most of the establishments were identical, and the food was overcooked and overpriced. Hospitality, if you were riding a bike, was usually zero. One day, I had set out from Jacksonville and headed for Pensacola, about a 360-mile trip. It was the kind of day that made you feel sorry for anyone cooped up in a car. The temperature was smack dab on 80 degrees, and only one tiny cloud was in sight, and it looked like it was heading for Georgia. There was money in my pocket and a whole week with nothing to do. Ah yes, life could be sweet. I just leaned on the bars, let the engine turn over at lazy RPM, and loped on down the highway. Traffic wasn't too bad for a Sunday, and the miles just melted on by. The urge to ride forever was there, and it felt good. Then that tiny cloud that was headed for Georgia did a 180-degree turn and headed right for me. 3 minutes later, rain was pouring and making life miserable. By the time I found an overpass to hide under, the rain had stopped and the sun was out again. That's Florida too. If you don't like the weather, just wait a few minutes. It'll change. Soon, I was back on the road again, wishing I had a front fender, as a thin line of road spray grit flung back in my face. Then mercifully, the rain stopped. In 20 more minutes, everything had dried up, and you would never have known the rain had been there at all, unless you looked at me, grubby, disheveled, with a neat trail of road mung splattered straight up the middle of my face and a matching trail down the back of my t-shirt. Then the bugs came. Hordes of the little bastards. Zap, splat, bug juice trickled off my chin and formed pools of yellow muck in the folds of my clothes. A half hour later, the bugs disappeared as suddenly as they had come, only to be replaced by sand blowing across the highway. The sand hit the bug juice, forming an oatmeal-textured substance that soon dried like a 10-year-old tube of 3M yellow weather-stripping glue. In short, I looked pretty bad. What had started the trip looking like a clean-cut American boy now looked like a reject from a B-axe murderer movie. Desperately in need of cleaning and food, I turned at the very next off-ramp that promised food, gas, and lodging. In that order. The sign looked reassuring. Y'all welcome, pecan pies and real Dixie chicken. Dinner now being served, $1.95, all the chicken you can eat. Far out, I thought. I'll just clean up and fill the bike and bod at the same time. There was an open parking spot right in front of the restaurant, so I pulled the bike up and shut it off. While flipping out the side stand and turning off the gas taps, I looked up and saw people staring at me through the plate glass windows. It was the Sunday after church crowd, all neatly dressed up and picking out on their $1.95 chicken meals. They looked at me like I was a mobile leper colony. It didn't appear to be a friendly crowd. I figured I'd just eat quickly and get back on the road. As I entered the restaurant, every person in the place gave me a cold, disdainful look. All of the tables were occupied except for one in the center of the room. I carefully walked over, waving away the flies that were buzzing around my body. The people stared harder. I've got just as much right to eat here as they have, I thought to myself. So I casually pulled back a chair and plopped down. You know those squeezed bottles of mustard that most restaurants have? Right, those kinds. Well, some twit had left one on the seat of the chair, and when I sat down, I landed directly on the mustard squeezer. I heard a loud sprat and looked up just in time to see a 30-foot stream of mustard shoot across the restaurant and land against the far wall. It left a thin, neat line all the way across tables, chairs, people's heads, food, carpeting, and a few waiters. There was a deathly silence. Then all hell broke loose. The manager and a 300-pound Chinese cook with a meat cleaver came out and started yelling at me. Some old lady to my right was yelling about her new dress and calling me all sorts of names old ladies are not supposed to know. I took the hint, promising to myself never to frequent this establishment again in the near future, and headed out to my waiting bike. Dozens of people followed, many holding knives and forks at the ready, like a bunch of Green Berets. Now I know how Marlon Brando felt in that biker movie. After nudging up the side stand and turning the petcocks on, I fired the bike up and made ready to part company. Might as well leave them with something to think about, I decided, so I revved the Triumph to about 7 grand and popped the clutch out, executing the ultimate wheelie of the century. It would have been, too, except for the fact that the tip of my side stand caught one of those coin-operated newspaper dispensers. I traveled about 8 feet until the news rack anti-theft chain stretched out and snag reached the end. The newspaper container literally exploded and the papers flew everywhere. It looked like a ticker tape parade on acid. This seemed like a good time to leave. As I rode down the highway, I heard sirens in the background. To play it safe, I pulled off the side of the road, laid the Triumph down behind some bushes, and hid. Half dozen cop cars screeched to a halt at the restaurant. The cops met with the arm-waving crowd of pissed-off people. Right after that, the cop cars started running up and down the road at high speed. I laid there in the bushes until dark, getting eaten alive by all sorts of carnivorous insects. Then rode with my lights off for nearly an hour until I got far, far away from that restaurant.